The bread was frozen solid. I had to hold it against my chest for 20 minutes before I could even bite into it. Half a loaf, maybe less. The last food I'd seen in 3 days. And I gave half of it to a dead man. Or at least, I thought he was dead. In Stalingrad during that winter, it was hard to tell the difference anymore. My name is Klaus Richter, and I'm the only survivor from my unit during the Stalingrad Collapse of January 1943. But the thing that haunts me most isn't the fighting or the cold or the dying. It's the man I shared my last bread with, because I'm still not sure if he was real. I was 22 years old, a corporal in the 6th Army, part of the force that was supposed to take Stalingrad and win the war in the East. That's what they told us. Take the city, break the Soviets. Victory by Christmas. It was September 1942 when we entered Stalingrad. By January 1943, we were trapped, surrounded, freezing and dying by the thousands. Christmas had come and gone. Victory was a joke we'd stopped telling. Our unit had been holed up in the ruins of a factory on the western edge of the city. 26 men when we took position in November. By January, we were down to 7. Not from fighting, mostly. The cold killed more than the Russians did. Frostbite, hypothermia, starvation. Men would just stop moving, stop breathing, freeze where they sat. We'd take their coats, their boots, anything that might help the rest of us survive another day. The factory was 3 stories of broken concrete and twisted metal. No roof, no windows, just walls that blocked some of the wind. We'd made a position in the basement, the only place with any protection, but even there the temperature was 30 below zero. Our breath froze in the air. Our weapons froze and wouldn't fire. Our food, what little we had, was solid ice. January 15th, 1943. That's when it happened. The day I met the ghost, or the man. I still don't know which. The Soviets had been pushing hard for days. Our lines were collapsing everywhere. Orders came through what was left of our radio. Fall back to the inner defensive ring. Regroup with other units. But falling back meant crossing 2 kilometers of open ground under Soviet fire. In daylight, in 30 below temperatures. It was suicide. Our Lieutenant Hoffman said we'd wait for nightfall. Make the run under cover of darkness. It made sense, except nightfall was 8 hours away and we hadn't eaten in 2 days. Some of the men were too weak to walk, sitting against the wall, staring at nothing, waiting to freeze. I'd seen it before. Once you stopped moving, you never started again. I volunteered to search the upper floors. Maybe someone had left supplies when the factory was evacuated. Maybe there was something, anything, we could use. Hoffman said it was too dangerous. The floors were unstable. Soviet snipers owned the sightlines. But I went anyway. Better to die doing something than freeze to death sitting still. The stairwell was partially collapsed. I had to climb over rubble to reach the 2nd floor. It was exposed, open to the sky, wind howling through the broken walls. Snow had drifted into corners, piled waist-deep in places. I searched carefully, methodically. Found nothing. Empty rooms, destroyed equipment, shell casings. Blood frozen black on the concrete. But no food, no supplies. I was about to go back down when I heard it. A voice, quiet, weak, speaking German. I followed the sound to a small room at the end of the floor, and there he was, a soldier, sitting against the wall, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform so tattered I couldn't tell what unit he was from. His face was grey, lips blue, eyes sunken deep in his skull. He looked like he'd been dead for weeks. But he was talking. He said he was cold, said he was hungry, asked if I had any food. His voice was barely a whisper. I had to kneel next to him to hear. I told him I had half a loaf of bread, my last bread, but I'd share it with him. He smiled, actually smiled, said I was kind, said God would remember that. I pulled the bread from my coat. It was frozen solid, like I said. I broke it in half, gave him 1 piece. He took it with hands that were black with frostbite, fingers that looked more like claws. He tried to bite the bread but couldn't. His jaw wouldn't work. So I helped him, broke off small pieces, put them in his mouth, let them melt. He ate slowly, painfully, but he ate. While he ate, he talked, told me his name was Ernst. Said he'd been separated from his unit during a Soviet attack 3 days ago. Been hiding in this room ever since, too weak to move, too scared to call out in case the Soviets found him. Just waiting. He asked about my unit, about the situation. I told him the truth. We were surrounded, cut off. The 6th Army was destroyed. We were probably going to die here. He nodded like he already knew. Said he'd made peace with it. Said he just didn't want to die alone. I told him he wouldn't. I'd stay with him until it was time to go. We sat there together in that frozen room eating frozen bread, waiting for whatever came next. He asked about my family. I told him about my mother in Munich, my younger sister, my father who died in the First War. He told me about his wife, his daughter, how his daughter would be 5 years old now, how he'd never seen her. She was born after he was deployed. He had a photo, but he'd lost it somewhere in the retreat. He cried when he talked about that, silent tears that froze on his cheeks. We must have talked for an hour, maybe more. Time was strange in Stalingrad, days blurred together, moments stretched into eternities. But I remember that conversation clearly. Remember every word, the things we talked about, the plans we made for after the war, even though we both knew there would be no after for us. It was comforting, having someone to talk to, someone who understood. Eventually I had to go. My unit would be moving soon. I couldn't stay. Ernst understood. He thanked me for the bread, for the company, for not leaving him alone. I told him to come with me. We'd carry him if we had to, but he shook his head. Said he couldn't walk. Said his legs were gone. Frostbite had taken them. I looked down. His legs were stretched out in front of him, covered by his coat. I couldn't see them, but I believed him. Frostbite took everything eventually. I told him I was sorry. He said it was all right, said he was ready, said he'd see his daughter soon. In heaven. If there was a heaven. I left him there, climbed back down to the basement, told Hoffman I'd found nothing, no supplies, no food. He asked about the bread. I said I'd eaten it. Needed the energy for the retreat. He accepted that. We waited for nightfall, then we ran. 4 of us made it to the inner ring. 3 died crossing the open ground. Soviet machine guns, mortar fire. 1 man just collapsed halfway across. Too weak to continue. We couldn't stop, couldn't help him. We just kept running and left him in the snow. The inner ring lasted 3 more weeks, then the 6th Army surrendered. What was left of it? 90,000 men taken prisoner. I was one of them. Marched east into captivity, into the gulags. I spent 8 years in Soviet labor camps, lost 2 toes to frostbite, lost half my teeth to scurvy, lost count of how many men I watched die. But I survived. In 1951 they released me, let me go home. I was one of the lucky ones. Only 6,000 of us made it back out of 90,000. I didn't think about Ernst for years. Too busy surviving, too busy trying to forget Stalingrad and everything that happened there. But after I got home, after things settled down, he started appearing in my dreams, sitting in that room, eating frozen bread, talking about his daughter, and I started wondering. I tried to find records, tried to find a soldier named Ernst who'd been in Stalingrad, who'd been separated from his unit in January 1943, who'd had a daughter. But there were thousands of Ernsts, tens of thousands, and the records were incomplete, destroyed, lost in the chaos of the collapse. I went back to Stalingrad in 1965. It was called Volgograd by then. Rebuilt, barely recognizable, but I found the factory, or where it had been. They'd torn it down, built apartments, but the location was the same. I stood where that room had been, where I'd shared my bread with Ernst, and I tried to remember exactly what he'd looked like, exactly what he'd said. That's when I started to doubt, started to wonder if he'd been real, because the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. A man sitting in that room for 3 days, in that cold, without food or water, without freezing to death, his legs gone but no blood, no smell of gangrene, just sitting there, waiting, and the things he knew. He'd asked about my unit, about the situation, but I never told him which unit I was from, never told him where we were positioned. How did he know to ask those specific questions? How did he know German so perfectly, when so many of us had picked up Russian words, Russian accents from months in the city? I started researching. reading accounts from other survivors, and I found stories, lots of stories, about ghosts in Stalingrad, about soldiers seeing their dead comrades, about conversations with men who couldn't have been there. The cold, the starvation, the stress, it did things to your mind, made you see things, hear things, believe things that weren't real. But the bread. I'd had half a loaf, I'd given half away. When I got back to my unit, I only had half. That was real. That happened. Hoffman had asked about it, had seen me with less than I'd left with. So either Ernst was real, or I'd given half my bread to an hallucination. And if I did that, if I was that far gone, how did I survive? I've spent 60 years trying to answer that question, trying to figure out if Ernst was real. I've talked to priests about it, about whether the dying can appear to the living, whether God sends comfort in our darkest moments. They give me non-answers, talk about faith and mystery and God's will, but they don't know. They weren't there. My therapist, when I finally saw one in the 1970s, said it was a trauma response, a manifestation of my own need for connection, that I'd created Ernst because I was desperate for human contact, for hope, for meaning in the meaningless hell of Stalingrad, that giving away my bread was a way of holding on to my humanity when everything else was stripped away. Maybe he's right. Maybe Ernst was never real. Maybe he was just my mind's way of coping, of staying human, of remembering that even in the worst circumstances we can choose kindness, can choose to share what little we have, can choose connection over isolation. But I don't think so, because I remember too clearly. Remember the weight of his hand when he took the bread. Remember the sound of his breathing. Remember the specific way he said his daughter's name, Maria. Remember details that seemed too precise to be invented, too real to be hallucination. I think Ernst was real. I think he was dying in that room. I think I gave him my last bread and we talked and then I left him there. And I think he died. Maybe minutes after I left. Maybe hours. But he died alone after all, despite my promise. And I've carried that guilt alongside the uncertainty for 60 years. Or maybe he wasn't real. Maybe he was a ghost, a spirit, an angel, something beyond explanation, sent to test me, to see if I'd share my last bread with someone in need, to see if I'd hold on to my humanity even when humanity seemed pointless. And maybe I passed that test. Maybe that's why I survived when so many didn't. I'm 83 years old now. The war ended 79 years ago. Most of the men I served with are dead. Most of the people who remember Stalingrad are gone. Soon I'll be gone too. And the truth about Ernst will die with me. Whether he was real or a ghost or a hallucination or something else entirely, it'll just be another mystery, another story from the war that can never be verified. But I'll tell you what I believe. I believe that in Stalingrad, in that frozen hell, the line between living and dead was blurred. I believe that men could exist in states between, could be dying but not dead, could be present but not entirely there. I believe that extreme conditions create extreme experiences that don't fit into normal categories of real and unreal. And I believe that sharing that bread, whether with a dying man or a ghost or a hallucination, was the right thing to do. It kept me human, kept me connected to who I was before the war, before Stalingrad, before the cold and the dying and the collapse. It was an act of humanity in an inhuman place, and maybe that's all that matters. Not whether Ernst was real, but that my choice to share was real. That kindness was real, even when everything else was falling apart. I shared my last bread with a ghost, or a man, or a memory, or a vision. I'll never know for sure. But I'm glad I did it, because in that moment, in that frozen room, we were both human, both alive, both connected by the simple act of breaking bread together. And in Stalingrad, where humanity went to die, that moment of connection, real or imagined, was everything. That's my story. That's what happened to me during the Stalingrad collapse. I met a man named Ernst, who may or may not have been real, and I gave him half my last bread, and I survived, and he didn't. And I've spent my whole life wondering what that means, what any of it means. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe it's just a story an old soldier tells himself to make sense of senseless suffering. Or maybe it means everything. Maybe it means that even in hell, even in the worst moments humans can create, There's still room for kindness, still room for sharing, still room for choosing humanity over survival. I'd like to think it's the latter. I'd like to think Ernst was real and that my small act of kindness mattered, that it meant something, that it made a difference in his final moments. But even if he wasn't real, even if he was a ghost or a dream or a break with reality, the choice was real. The bread was real. The humanity was real. And maybe that's enough.